Hey guys, it's Sports213 here, and today we're going to be going over the top position players in Fantasy Football 2025 going into Week 13, and in other words, after Week 12. So, starting off with last week's top position players for Week 12. At QB, I don't think anybody expected Jameis Wayward Winston to be the highest scoring QB in fantasy last week, as he had 32.24 fantasy points in the Giants' overtime loss against the Detroit Lions. Yep, this is only Jameis Winston's second start of the season, and yep, he surprised everyone by going off. And not to mention, yes, the Giants could have almost won that game if they hadn't went for it on fourth down. But Jameis Winston, he actually threw for a touchdown, and he actually caught one as well. So, yep. But the highest scoring QB in fantasy for the second straight week still is Josh Allen, and he currently sits at 255.46 fantasy points, despite his poor performance on Thursday night against the Houston Texans, where the Texans dominated him. Well, when he was sacked 7 to 8 times, something like that. But if Josh Allen wants to maintain his spot as QB1 or even be locked up as QB1 this season, he's going to need at least a couple more monster performances during these last 6 weeks of the season. Because if he doesn't, then there could be someone else that could take over as QB1 for the season. Going on over to running back, Jahmyr Gibbs is the highest scoring running back in fantasy last week, scoring a 50 burger with 55.4 fantasy points in a Lions overtime win against the Giants. Yep, another player from that thrilling Lions-Giants game from last week. Yep, and Jahmyr Gibbs did score the touchdown in overtime that won it for the Lions. And then the Lions won on a defensive stop on fourth down. It was due to the overtime rules that they changed. But still the highest scoring running back after 12 weeks, and for the second straight week, Christian McCaffrey with 311.1 fantasy points. He is the first player, Christian McCaffrey is the first player this season to reach 300 fantasy points, thanks to his great performance on Monday night against the Niners. No, for the Niners against the Panthers. Yep, against his old team, in which the Niners won. Yep, and right behind him is Jonathan Taylor. Like I said, Jonathan Taylor is going to be the only one that can challenge McCaffrey for the top spot of running back in fantasy for RB1. And right behind those two is Jahmyr Gibbs, as he is the third highest scoring running back thanks to that monster performance against Detroit. Now going on to the receivers. The top scoring receiver last week is JSN with 37.1 fantasy points in the Seahawks win against the Titans. And that is good enough for JSN to still be the highest scoring receiver after 12 weeks. And for the third straight week, he sits as the highest scoring receiver in fantasy, sitting at 255 fantasy points. And the next closest is George Pickens with around 220-ish something fantasy points. Yep, George Pickens is only 35 points behind. So if JSN continues to keep going off this season like he has been, he's going to end up as this year's wide receiver 1. Moving on to the tight ends. The highest scoring tight end in fantasy last week is Hunter Henry with 24.5 or 24.5 fantasy points in the Patriots win against the Bengals. But the highest scoring tight end after 12 weeks is Trey McBride, currently sitting at 201.7 fantasy points. For the fourth straight week, Trey McBride sits as the highest scoring tight end in fantasy overall. And the next closest to him is Jake Ferguson, who is about 50 points behind Trey McBride for the top spot of tight end in fantasy. Yep. I think it's pretty obvious that Trey McBride could be locked up as the top scoring tight end in fantasy as long as he stays healthy and continues to go off at this ridiculous pace. So, yep. Now moving on to the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams. Yep, the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams from last week is the Rams teams, defense, and special teams with 20 fantasy points. They had 2 interceptions. One of those went for pick 6, and they've sacked the Bucs 4 times in their Sunday night win against them. But the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams after 12 weeks, it is not the Seahawks anymore, as it is now the Texans that are the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams with 118 fantasy points. It's all because of them sacking Josh Allen 7 to 8 times and intercepting him twice. Yep. Thanks to that, now they're the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams. Yep, their defense has been good this season when it shouldn't be, in my opinion. And yes, right behind the Texans teams, defense, and special teams is the Seahawks teams, defense, and special teams, who for the last few weeks were the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams. We're now sitting at like 111 fantasy points. So I think it could come down to those two teams, defense and special teams, as long as they continue to go off in these last 6 weeks of the season. Then the highest scoring kicker from last week is Andy Borregales for the Patriots, who had 18 fantasy points in their win against the Bengals. So you got another Patriots player on here that is the highest scoring for a position in fantasy. But the highest scoring kicker after 12 weeks, yep, I knew it. It was going to be Jason Myers. He is the highest scoring kicker in fantasy after 12 weeks, currently sitting at 120 fantasy points, all due to Cam Dicker, or Dicker the kicker, having a bye week because the Chargers had a bye week, and Jason Myers took advantage of that and made as many kicks as he could to take over the top spot of kicker of fantasy. And if he continues to make his kicks, he could for sure be the top kicker in fantasy this season. Now, there are 2 more players that I wanted to point out that have went off for 30 or more fantasy points this week, as not only Jameis Winston, Jahmyr Gibbs, and JSN, they were not the only 3 that went off for 30 or more fantasy points, as Jahmyr Gibbs is the highest scoring player in fantasy for last week with that 50-burger performance. And he was the only running back to surpass 30 or more fantasy points last week. But the only other QB that's reached over 30 or more fantasy points last week, other than Jameis Winston, is Jalen Hurts with 30.86 fantasy points in the Eagles' loss against the Cowboys, which they blew a 21-0 lead. And another New York Giant player on here, the other receiver that went over for 30 or more fantasy points last week, was Wan'Dale Robinson with 30.6 fantasy points. So, yep, those are the top position players of Fantasy Football 2025 going into Week 13. And in other words, after Week 12, we have only 2 more weeks. That's right, 2 more weeks of the Fantasy Football regular season until we get to the Fantasy Football playoffs, which is the final 4 weeks of the regular season. Yep, so that's all I gotta say for this one, and I'll see you guys later, and stay tuned for when I go over the top position players in fantasy football 2025 going into week 14, and in other words, after week 13.